Knowing the most common types of issues that people have when they go out in the great outdoors is going to give you an advantage to know what to prepare for. It's common sense. If you know that this happens, you can do this or that, or have at least a few things in contingency, in reserve, if you will, to handle that. So you never want to just go out in the great outdoors, in particular, miles and miles away from any population center, and not have any type of means to problem solve things that are common that happens to us. And so, after years of looking into this myself, because I want to be prepared, I'm talking about I've read countless reports from the Parks Department, the Department of the Interior. I looked at all kinds of state police, various investigative reports, read a lot of blogs on this subject matter. I actually know law enforcement officers that I'm friends with. And pulling all this information over the years, I have to say that I've come to a conclusion of the top 5 ways that people get themselves in big trouble. In particular, this is going to be a list about how people perish. It's not really a very fun picture to paint here, but I'm just saying that this is how people die. This is how people die when they're in the woods and they're not prepared. And so I'm just going to go through this, and hopefully this will give you a little bit more awareness of things that actually do happen. Now, there's a lot of confliction, and I'll try to break that up a little bit as I go. So I'm not conflicting with the data. I'm just going to lay it out in a little bit more simplistic term so that it all makes sense. So the first thing that the people typically die from, this is number 1, and I'm going to work from number 1 down to number 5. So the first and foremost thing that people die from is accidents and injuries from the accidents typically. A lot of people would say, well, the data typically is categorized, and this is my number 2, is exposure. Technically speaking, it is true that the exposure is pretty much what kills you, but you wouldn't be in the situation to have the exposure if it wasn't for the accident. So accidents really is the main reason why people perish. It's the underlying reason. And so when we're out and about, it's just, watch where we're stepping, don't step on a rattlesnake, don't fall down a cliff. Trip and falls is one of the top things that are cited for head injuries and things like that. So you have to just watch your step. It's probably the single best piece of advice I can give to you is watch your step, be mindful of your environment. Every once in a while, look up and look to your side to side as you're walking. There's been times I've known, even for myself, I'll be walking in the woods and a limb will fall or break off a tree just as I'm walking underneath of it, and you can get really hurt, if the limb is big enough or the tree is, large enough. It can really do you in. So anyways, something to kind of pay attention to. So number 1 is accident and injury. Number 2 is exposure. Exposure typically happens in the format of in colder climates, basically. And it's not to say that people don't overheat and they die of that, but hypothermia is going to be something that's a little bit more rare compared to hypothermia. And so basically, hypothermia is the number 1 reason for the exposure part. People get themselves out into situations that they can't get in to a warm location, or they can't just warm their body up pretty much. And so if you fall into a lake or a pond and it's freezing cold, your first priority is to get out of that clothes and warm, or you could perish in a matter of minutes. No joke. Okay, so the next thing is going to be number 3, and that's medical emergencies. This is where strokes, heart attacks, other kind of things happen. Now, this is still relatively rare at this particular point. The first 2 happen the most, obviously. This third one, you don't really hear a lot of times people having like a heart attack out in the middle of the woods, because most people that are physically fit go out in the woods. People who are not physically fit don't typically go out in the woods. And I'm not saying that just because you're physically fit, you can't have a medical emergency. Obviously not. But you'd be surprised about how many people think that they're impervious to things happening to them. So you have to be mindful to have the means to communicate out for help. That's the thing on this one. You have to have a means to signal, because if minutes count in this kind of situation. So if there's any kind of history of heart disease and stuff like that, it would probably be beneficial not only to have routine checkups, obviously, and then take care of yourself, obviously, and de-stress as much as possible, eat good food, but maybe to carry a sat phone, or a transponder. But anyways, that's up to you. Number 4 is that people get lost. You'd be surprised. Once again, this is a little bit rare once again, but people do get lost, and it kind of really causes a lot of complications, because when people get lost, they get real panicky. And then what happens is they typically walk in circles over time. The body, when you're walking, your gait, you either walk to the right or the left, and you will eventually make a circle. There's no such thing as people walking just straight on their own. So you have to be mindful of that. That's why you have to kind of take markers, take bearings from the sun. That's why having a compass is really helpful. I mean, that kind of solves that problem. And at least, knowing where you are and have a map, that's even better. But before you leave somewhere, just make sure at least 2 people know that where you're going and how long you're supposed to be out there. And if you don't come back, you want someone to look for you immediately. You could be in great pain. You could be on death's door. So you want people to respond. Now, there's a lot of, different rules of different parks and different cities and states that do things differently. Some people require that you're actually, reported missing for at least 48 hours or 24 hours or so before they even start looking for you. But you need to know all that so that you know how to overcome, or at least try to endure. If you know that it's going to be at least 48 hours before anybody is deployed, you're going to make sure you have provisions to get through those hours and maybe days. And the last, number 5 here, is excessive risk-taking. Now, this kills people because it kind of falls hand in hand with number 4 when people get lost. There's an element of this that people panic, and then they kind of do really silly things. They don't start thinking with their head. They start thinking with their emotions, and they get really into trouble because they might be walking way too fast. They might start running through the woods, trips and falls, and now they have a compound problem. Now, not only are they lost, but now they're injured, and they're not even thinking straight. And this is just a major problem. So if you have one problem, you don't need to make more problems on top of the problem. So you need to slow down and calm down. Now, there's another aspect of number 5, excessive risk. Excessive risk-taking can also be from showing off with friends and stuff. I know when I was younger, we did some really stupid things. Climbing trees that we should have not been climbing, jumping off of side of hills and basically rock cliffs into water bodies that were way too high, and we weren't even sure how deep the water below was. For all we know, we could have, hit our head on a log or a rock and killed ourselves, but we just didn't know. We just did it because it was cool, and fun at the time. But it's not worth it, man. Our life is not worth goofing around because you want to go home at the end of the day. And you want to go home and watch YouTube videos, right? So that's the top 5, from what I've been able to see and kind of gather. And so let me just recap. Accidents and injuries, exposure of the elements, medical emergencies, being lost, and excessive risk-taking. Now that you know this, make a little plan or 2 for each one of these of how you would overcome it. For some of these, you can have the same solution for, ongoing for maybe 2 or 3, but basically, here, I'll just give you an example. If you have an accident or injury, you probably want to have a way to at least stop bleeding, so you don't go into shock, or help you dealing with shock, and a means to communicate for help, so that's kind of common sense. maybe a way to signal as well if you don't have a radio or a cell phone connection or even a satellite phone. So it could be a whistle or a signal mirror or the ability to make a signal fire, whatever. Exposure, this is very common sense, is to have, if you're out in the heat, have the means to cool down, and when you're in the cold, have means to warm up, even if it means carry a couple road flares with you, so that if you have to get heat, you have heat. Sometimes you can't be waiting around because your fine motor skills goes first. And before you know it, I've heard a lot of situations, there's a lot of really, really sad stories that people lose their dexterity to the point that they can't even strike their matches. Their hands are so numb. And then they die, even though they have the means to get warm. So don't be like that. Don't it's almost like a type of suicide almost, you know what I'm saying? Even though these people didn't really commit suicide, it was a suicide by omission almost. It's just needless. Medical emergencies, once again, having some first aid knowledge and first aid items. Maybe it's aspirin that you need to take because of maybe your heart or some type of medicine you need to bring with you, or once again, the means to call out for help, things like that. And if you're lost, once again, knowing navigation, knowing where you are, having a map, telling people where you are and where you're supposed to be, and to have them call out for help if you're not there. And excessive risk taking is basically just reeling in your ego. Now, the older we get, we don't typically have the same kind of problems with that. Like now, I just don't have any interest in taking any risks. I'm just like a big scaredy cat, and I'll admit it because I don't want to get hurt. I've injured myself enough in my life, and I've had all kind of operations. I've been not a daredevil, but daggone, I've totally mellowed out in my life, and I still know people that haven't chilled out, and they wonder why they're always injured. Heck. I can't hardly even cut a few trees or something, and I'm worn out, or my shoulder hurts, I probably injure myself more when I sleep. I was just telling my mom this the other day. I was like, man, I injure myself more when I sleep than even when I'm awake. And this is what happens when you get older. Stuff just starts aching and my bones are popping, and I'm not even that old. So I'm just telling you, there's no reason to take all of these risks because it just never pays off. And you don't want to have to go through your whole life, dealing with an injury. Because, sometimes when you injure yourself in certain ways, it never heals completely. And I have a family member that has actually broken his back in multiple spots, and it's never been the same. Once you break your back or you tear certain muscles, it just never is the same. And so, all right, so enough of that. Top 5 there. Hope that helped. You guys take care.